These violent delights have violent ends.
Hi, welcome everyone to the first of a series of discussions about different shows that have been remade, and we want to kind of explore not only what makes the originals great, but also what can work different times in the sequels and reboots and whatnot that make it even more enjoyable and other ways richer than the source content. So sit back, and my name is John Chang, and I'm with Dan Edmunds, who will meet shortly. And welcome to our first discussion about Westworld. Yeah, so I think maybe one way to kind of get things going, to kind of get started, so to speak, is basically talk about how, I think, or one of the things that we've talked about before, is the things that I feel other shows or other kind of things on YouTube and otherwise, I include podcasts also, that they really don't do, is that they don't really talk about the ideas behind the shows. They talk about, shows are great, they, or all the different kind of, plot points and stuff like that. And that's all, absolutely, there's a place for that. We need that. I mean, I'm a big fan actually of the one podcast, Decoding Westworld, with a couple of these guys, Mike Chen, I think is his name, and what's called his partner, and there's absolutely a place for that kind of show and stuff like that. But I think at the same time, I really as you and I have talked about, I love like kind of just the ideas behind these shows that that make up the themes, that make up like kind of that drive some of the story, and I think that's one of the things that like really we can kind of dive into as well. And the other thing that is kind of the little bit of a spin or twist is simply the idea, which we'll talk about of course today, is how you have these reboots, remakes, stuff like that, and there's things that make the originals great, and things that sometimes can even elevate the story of the things to make it where it's such a fresh take that it's a whole new thing altogether. Whether it's Battlestar Galactica, whether it's just some of these other shows that have really they bring not only new life to a franchise or a genre or particular property and stuff, but they really carve out a place of their own. And I feel like that's really what Westworld has done, and that's really why today we're going to be talking about the show and stuff. So
no, absolutely. No, that's, I mean, for me, it's kind of, the Westworld is very obviously, it's this case of how the world views AI. Where do we see AI? Is it a threat? What are the implications of conscious artificial intelligence, really?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start. One of the things that we've seen more and more is certainly, the AI being kind of used in different ways that there's the ones that we probably always kind of thought okay, wouldn't be cool if, and then there's the ways that it's starting to become almost beyond what we ever even imagined the stuff. Like one simple one, to be honest, which is what we're be putting this video on, is YouTube. The AI behind it is such that there was an article, I don't think I shared it with you actually, I'll have to kind of dig it back up, but it's scary in a way, and this is one of the programmers behind YouTube's algorithm was saying about how they're made to basically feed into what drives not only watch time but also just engagement and stuff. So that's that's the two things that on the light side, if you will, with YouTube, it kind of brings communities together. It kind of really is tailored to, your interest, my interest, or, any individuals and stuff like that. But the dark side, though, is that, like, as we also have, subsequently found out, is that, like, it brings together, people like pedophiles. It brings together people like, just very unsavory people that, like, unfortunately, that also have an interest in specific things and, doing things for, definitely not so positive. So that's like kind of, again, like it's like the kind of technology in general. As for you and I agree on that, it's not a good or evil thing, but unfortunately, it definitely can be used for either purpose and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tool, and it just it just enhances whatever direction anyone wants to go in. And I mean, in terms of evil people, I mean, one thing someone mentioned to me today, they said, before YouTube, how many people actually thought the world was flat? Is the whole flat earth thing, is YouTube like 90% responsible for people thinking the world is flat, or the moon, landing was a hoax? Before YouTube, you did a before and after. But I mean, in terms of people using these things in dodgy ways, just to sort of game the algorithms, if you ever let your children just hit autoplay on YouTube, there's even a TED talk about it. Within about 10 videos, you've got some really disturbing things on your screen. So, yeah, I mean, but you're right. I mean, it's great that you have this platform, but the way those algorithms work is weird. But of course, now they're all being reined in. YouTube is now, it's hard to find flat Earth videos, hard to find, Alex Jones like things. There's obviously some sort of censorship, but I mean, it's about time YouTube started, or any social media is starting to be treated like a media platform. They should, in my opinion anyway, they should sort of have the same kind of rule sets that you'd expect. But,
and going back to Westworld, we have like this world.
We were just going here for, right?
Well, going back to Westworld, we have this world where, on the plus side, it seems like, okay, cool. Like, you have a place where you can live out your fantasies. You can basically enjoy, like, kind of, these adventures and stuff like that. That's great. Again, going to the dark side and stuff like that is like, okay, you find that, like, here, like, you can have a psychopath go about and just kill robots and stuff like that, and they're indulging in their tendencies, right, to, like, kind of have not only disregard for life, but also just basically just, like, kind of just go around, living out these violent, fantasies. In fact, one of the favorite quotes for season 1 probably, right, is, these violent desires have violent ends and stuff. And it's like kind of, I think it's like very much encapsulates that idea, though, that, like, I think that's one of the things we really saw in the first season is, people kind of like their worst desires, and like kind of, and how it's like kind of this place to kind of live those out and stuff like that. So, I think that's maybe like kind of in some ways, the metaphor for, like kind of the internet, and how we basically, like, if you have any kind of weird, kinky, desire, this and that, or like kind of, interests and stuff like that, you can find it nowadays. I mean, it's, like kind of, I mean, I don't, to be honest, I don't know too much about the dark web and all that, but I do know that, like, that was where a place that, like, if you wanted to get it, that was like, the place to, it was always like kind of like what we used to say about like visiting New York City and stuff like that, was that, like, if you have the money, if you have, whatever you want to get, you can get there and stuff like that. And the dark web, essentially, from what I understand, is like basically that way that, and I think that's like kind of, again, one of the things that, one of the ways that the show is really relevant is just like kind of this, just the other series I think you and I have talked about separately, of course, is Black Mirror, where basically it's like kind of taking this dark mirror to looking at our current reality, like kind of the things that are happening and stuff like that.
Yeah, we should definitely do a video on the latest season of Black Mirror, because I think it's quite different from the previous ones. you're right. I think, like, in a way, yeah, there's a lot of current issues that come up in Westworld that are just kind of repackaged slightly. Like you said, it's like the internet is like our playground of exploring, anything that we want to do, basically, good or bad. But likewise, in season 2, where you had the idea that Delos was collecting all of the park's visitors' data and, just keeping a hold of it just for use for their own experiments is kind of, that's Google and Facebook right there. It's that's pretty clear what they're trying to do with that. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, there's a lot of, and this idea that that is kind of, I think, quite current as well, as this idea of how we behave online. Does it spill over into real life? And I think Dolores kind of represents that a little bit in that if you think of the park as like an encapsulation of what the internet represents to us, her breaking out of it is kind of like, well, what happens if we take these behaviors, these algorithms, they actually start, running rampant in real life, not just within a controlled environment.
Yeah, I think what you just said too about Dolores is kind of interesting as well. That we're the other thing that to me she represents is how, like, it's funny because in the show, the human beings are the ones that, like, as we've kind of seen, like, hopefully not too much of a spoiler, but we come to find out or learn that, like, that their programming, like, kind of when it's collected into, like, kind of drill down, is like basically about a book's worth, and not that thick of a book, like, kind of. So in other words, like, it turns out that our programming is relatively simple and stuff like that. And I feel like that's one of the things that the show really kind of, like, pokes fun at in some ways, is that, like, that, we think we're really these sophisticated beings and stuff like that. But the other, we're, according to the show, like, our data basically fits into like a relatively thin novel, stuff like that. And I think that's a great, like, kind of concept, like, kind of that's one of those things that, like, you laugh to a degree, but to another degree, it's like kind of like, yeah, that's kind of true. Like, we kind of start realizing how, like, we're maybe not as sophisticated sometimes as we think we are and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely lots of psychological tests where you can kind of quite easily lead people down a very specific path. But I mean, it's interesting for me that Westworld is one of those shows where the simple take, I mean, let's say take it back to where the original Westworld and like the 70s treatment of AI, where you had, like, it started, I think, pretty much with 2001, which is like where, like, we create these super intelligent machines that could turn against us. I think that I can't think of an earlier example of where AI goes bad.
Right.
But then you had, this is Westworld, I guess, was 73, so that was pretty early on. And you had, like, other movies like Saturn 3 with Kirk Douglas, if you've ever seen it. That's a very obscure one, yeah. And the obvious one from the 70s that isn't where the AI goes bad is Star Wars, because in that universe, they got rid of all the robots because they realized they're bad already, which was, again, quite a sort of interesting take. But that was kind of like, there's all kind of anti-AI in a way. And in a way, Westworld is kind of anti-human in that it sort of says that it's our worst impulses that will actually sort of drive us down the wrong path. But it's kind of anti-AI as well. It's kind of saying, we can't really contain this thing that we create, and it'll our own worst impulses that bring out the worst in that. So it's
and that's,
and I would say almost.
I was going to say that it's hard not to like, kind of draw parallels to Battlestar Galactica, because it's the same idea that, like, we create something that then at some point turns on us and stuff like that. And like you said, those other examples are very much the idea of technology turning on us and stuff. But in the end, it's still also this idea of how it's like we created something that was supposed to serve us and stuff like that, but at some point we lose control of it. And part of the other parallels, or the other kind of just to go little bit more in that direction is like Planet of the Apes. Of course, it's another one that kind of very much is, and kind of, that one's like similar in a lot of respects about kind of, but like kind of taking a life form and technology, or using that as a technology and stuff like that. And the other one, of course, is the whole Lost World series and stuff, where again, like kind of it's the similar vein of technology, which ironically, of course, is Michael Crichton's other work and stuff like that. But all the same idea though about technology getting away from us and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's Battlestar Galactica. Well, the reboot obviously was the first one that really kind of looked at the complexities of how a society would potentially live with another, with some sort of conscious artificial intelligence. And Westworld is, I think the thing with that show was that it looked at those issues, but it looked at it in a very abstracted way, because it was a different race on a different planet, and it didn't try any kind of historical context of Earth, aside from the odd references back to Apollo, and the idea that these, there might be some ancient alien history going on there. But Westworld it takes those complexities and also puts it in a fairly modern context, and tries to make it as feasible as possible. I think that's what Jonathan Nolan does with a lot of his stuff. He tries to take something quite fantastical, like in the Dark Knight series, and really try and base it as much as he can in reality, and he does a pretty admirable job most of the time. But yeah, I mean, with Westworld, the thing that the episode that really stuck with me, and I remember talking to a lot of people, it's been about season 2, and it was one that not many people really liked, but it was the one, the riddle of the Sphinx, the fidelity test with Delos, where he's where you realize that one of the functions of the park was in order to make an immortal copy of Delos, the guy who funded it all. And this fidelity test of, is it actually possible for a human mind to exist in an artificial intelligence box and not go mad, which in the Westworld universe, they would say it's far easier to create a self-sufficient AI that can think for itself. That's the only way you can have something that will live in an AI kind of shell. Whereas, as I've mentioned to you before, Robin Hanson with his Age of M book, he thinks the opposite. He thinks that we'll digitize human consciousness before we get to a pure AI, and he thinks that's hundreds of years off. One thing though, it's a very interesting book. If anyone's seen, he's basically tried to make a very dry, academic, almost history book of the future. That was the kind of idea of it, and he doesn't try and sort of sugarcoat it and does things in a very kind of analytical way. So it's quite a tough read, but it's also quite interesting. But that was published, I think, in 2016, and I did a little bit more research on that, and he tracks the progress of artificial intelligence to hardware increases. And he says, you can almost draw a line of where hardware and AI has increased. But I think subsequently, from 2016 to 2019, the improvement in algorithms has actually meant that AI has improved quite significantly, even though computing hasn't. And one of the other things that's perhaps helping that is more specialized processes. So apparently they are, like, I think Google's DeepMind, I want to say, or the AlphaGo, I can't remember the exact name of it, but anyway, they actually made custom processors for that in order for it to do the kind of that kind of AI algorithmic processing. But the weird thing for me about this is that they're building specialized processors for AI, and our ultimate goal is generalized intelligence. But it seems to me that the way AI, because our general processing is hitting a plateau. Moore's law is kind of slowing down, and the only way they're getting better with AI is to build more specialized processors for different things. Now, of course, the thing that we talk about with robots in Westworld is that they have a general intelligence. That's what makes them kind of seem human and conscious. But it may be that that is far further in the future than we can do. It may be that we have very, very specialized forms of intelligence, and we can do those really well. But the slowing down of Moore's law and general processing becoming, leveling off means that we may not be able to tie these different sort of types of AI together into something that thinks like a human.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point though about in fact that was one of the quotes that Tim Ferriss, he's another person I follow, stuff like that. That he kind of talks about is that specializations for insects and stuff, and I can see in some ways that just even we look at the theoretical hierarchy of intelligence and all that, we went from of course single cell to multi-cell, and then insects is at some point kind of one of the most sophisticated organized life form, but yet it's kind of in the hierarchy of other life forms and stuff, it's still one of the lowest and everything, because and for the most part they're designed for specialized a bee has a very specific kind of function and for that matter a drone bee and stuff like that versus kind of a bird or and I think that's the thing that is an interesting point though about how it's in theory how we really evolved and kind of developed and stuff like that was our ability to kind of really adapt to very much have a wide variety of skills and abilities and stuff like that, and ironically of course we in some ways kind of regressed or kind of took our step backwards and stuff when the age of the industrial age and stuff, and then we became specialized again after of course Ford, which is kind of a ironic for this show and stuff like that, where Henry Ford kind of basically found that the way to kind of get more productively from the workers is to have them specialize. Kind of one person puts on the door handle, another one puts on the engine, and so on and so forth and stuff like that. But then I think with the information age, what started happening again is that we've kind of flipped the switch yet again, and now there's a lot of value of people who to some degree develop some deep expertise, but to another degree they they're kind of really fluid and flexible in terms of what they learned and stuff like that. So so that's kind of a very, I don't know, it's probably something that hasn't really happened, which again probably is in parallel with the fact that we haven't had an age where we have this much access to information and stuff, that where you have to have the ability to kind of dive deep into different things but still be flexible enough to kind of adapt to a wide variety of knowledge and stuff like that. For example, an entrepreneur may be great at designing products or software and stuff like that, and yet he or she has to have quite a bit of understanding of marketing and how to deal with online Facebook ads versus using YouTube or Instagram, and then for that matter be ready and able to the fact that maybe not next week or next month, but in the next year certainly is likely that he has to quickly, or she again, has to be really able to adapt to new technology to spread the word for their product or service over their competition and stuff like that. So I think that's another interesting dynamic has happened because of the technology and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works well for humans. Let's put it that way. So this idea of being a multitasker and you have to. I mean, certainly in modern life, I think if you can dive deep into something and then move on to something else, or work on 2 or 3 other things at some level of specialization, but don't fix into one thing, because obviously with if any technology plays a role in your job, it's going to change, and so you know you have to adapt with it. But I wonder, in terms of how much progress has actually been made on getting that sort of general intelligence, because I mean, you've seen there's obviously huge leaps in specialized intelligence. I mean, really quite astounding leaps of specialized intelligence. But will it all come together? It's hard to tell me. But yeah, I thought the fidelity test was one that really that was one that really kind of stayed with me, because I often, there's a bit of wish fulfillment that kind of thinks, will I be able to record my consciousness onto the internet at some point, and in 50 years? But,
yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely something that I think a lot of us find, fascinating, the idea of like kind of uploading our consciousness, and like where is that, will that lead, or kind of, like I don't know, like kind of just part of me has to admit that like I can definitely see it happening in our lifetime. It's, like kind of because of just how quickly the technology is kind of like, just on this exponential curve and stuff. And again, like kind of if like what the show puts out is kind of true, that we're relatively simple, our programming, so like that, then that can very much be the case. But then here's the question though, like, is then like if you did upload your consciousness and stuff like that, is that really you? Like I think that's like kind of a more like almost philosophical question, right, and stuff. Like what is, who is Dan, who is John, right, and stuff, and is the our consciousness, our concept. I mean, I think that's like kind of, to me, like one of the kind of fundamental questions, right? Like since the beginning of time, that kind of deal. That like what is, who are we? Like kind of, the sense of like, what does that really mean, right? To be us and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's someone, I can't remember what it was, on a TED Talk or something like this, but they said there's actually more nerve endings feeding from your stomach to your brain than there is from your brain to the rest of your body. So it's almost like, well, you're taking in more information from your body than your brain is giving out. So what actually constitutes the control mechanism of what drives your behavior?
Right.
Yeah, no, I think it's the question. I mean, I think that they do sort of bring that up in Westworld as well. They have this idea that, Dolores, even though she's broken out of her programming and she's, doing something that she's definitely not on a loop anymore, but she's still following Ford's programming to some degree, or Arnold's, depending on, that's still a bit sort of ambiguous as to did Arnold go about, specifying their own individuality, or his idea of it, to the point where they're kind of just following his program. Because Ford seems to have just allowed them the possibility of recalling their memories and using that to sort of bolster their experiences. Whereas it still kind of, and he obviously keeps Arnold around as Bernard, but you wonder if how much of them, there's still this kind of thing alluded to even in season 2 where they're still kind of following the program. Like when Maeve breaks out and she's on the train, and it's still kind of like she's following the program, which is, it makes you wonder, there may be, the point may be that maybe there isn't any true kind of conscious will that you can create artificially. It'd be interesting if they are actually, and it's all just some sort of massive trolling exercise by Arnold or something. Is I doubt the series will end on those notes, but it could be something like that.
Like one of the quotes that I love personally is from V from Vendetta about artists using lies to tell the truth. And so shows like this, not besides kind of just be able to kind of stimulate this kind of conversation and stuff, is that like, and also like kind of, like again, like another show like Black Mirror, where it's a really interesting reflection on kind of, like taking a look at modern life or society and stuff like that. And so for me, like this show kind of definitely makes me take a look at, like kind of what kind of things do I do that are loops, like kind of, are these kind of programs that we kind of just, do almost without thinking, right? And it's really fascinating to me, like, because we see in the show how, like, people like Teddy and, Dolores and stuff like that, they have, like, kind of, the certain way they get up, certain, like, they have this ritual almost of, like, kind of, going to the creek and painting or something like that. And we, we as human beings, we have, like, a lot of these loops as well, like, kind of, and that's what it made me think about, like, kind of, there's a certain way I like to, like, make my coffee, like, and then, then get into my writing, or, like, kind of, and that's fascinating to me as well, like, kind of how it's a real reflection on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the sort of unfortunate thing about the show is that a lot of people that I knew who I said, you've got to watch this, it's really good. They watched the first couple of episodes and they're like, well, it's just this character just kind of getting up and doing the same things over and over again. That kind of, but I thought the repetition was quite effective, because for me, it made me intrigued as to what was going to happen. Whereas, if you maybe don't have quite the patience, you would say, like, oh, well, this is boring. It's just the same thing, and I don't quite get it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of that. It makes you look at, how much of our life are loops that we program ourselves or are being programmed to some degree. I think the other.
Go ahead.
I mean, I was going to say the other theme that I thought was really interesting in season 2 was the idea of memory and how that's messed around with. Because I think it was one of the interviews with Jonathan Nolan. It's like, what do you do with a conscious being that has perfect recall of every event that's ever happened? I mean, if we could go back and perfectly recall all of our life, we would be very different people, or different human beings.
Right.
So I thought that was really interesting. They messed around with memory, especially the Bernard's character in season 2. I haven't had any great insight about it, but it's a very interesting sort of concept.
Yeah, it's certainly. I think in some ways, probably for me personally, I feel like kind of that having an imperfect memory is what is done to protect us, right? Where a lot of times, like kind of the painful memories, like we sooner forget, that kind of idea, and I feel like that's one of the things that, like, really, are the way we're designed as human beings. It's kind of designed to, like, kind of basically, like, kind of, okay, so then reliving something, like, it's kind of like what we have is, like, kind of this fuzzy glow around, like, kind of, things that happened in the past, right? Everything's kind of like the sulfur light kind of thing and stuff, versus, like, kind of the painful thing, like that time when you, like, did something stupid and kind of ended up getting your head smacked into the cement kind of deal and stuff. Like, I mean, if you have perfect memory, you would remember that, crystal clearly, and that would really, again, just kind of like, oh man, like, kind of, hurt in a real sense kind of way as well. And that's not even including, like, kind of, the more psychological pain that we go through and stuff, where, like, like argument or a breakup, or, like that kind of thing and stuff. So I think that's one of the things that, like, kind of in some ways, that we're designed, like, kind of, to deal with things. But I think, like, kind of, it is really fascinating, like, kind of, if you have, like, this perfect memory, as you do with the hosts and AI and stuff in Westworld, like, what do you do and stuff like that. And I think that was, like, kind of really was the sophisticated way that they handled it. And so I think, before we kind of, we're kind of diving into, like, how I'm, like, maybe the next round of kind of ideas, I just want to kind of take a few minutes to kind of talk about, like, kind of, the differences between the old and the new, the original movie, and, the series and stuff like that. Certainly, there's things that we liked about, it's pretty clear we're both kind of pretty much fans of the new ones and stuff like that. But I did just want to kind of recognize, like, kind of some of the key differences and stuff. For me, like, one of the number one differences is that, like, especially in the original movie, it wasn't until Future World that they really dived into more of the other stories, you know, like kind of the Delos and all that kind of stuff. That wasn't so much in the original one. It was a pretty simplistic plot with just basically that, you know, the robots started going crazy and then they, you know, attack, you know, like kind of the humans and stuff like that. But, you know, from season 1, the first episode, right away, we started recognizing there's a lot going on and there's something kind of really funky going on, that kind of thing and stuff. So even though like it's very much like kind of, you know, built out into like, you know, multi episodes, and sometimes like what we, you know, these shows nowadays have this idea of, you know, they're you know, mini series, right? Like kind of, even if it's like just a television series and stuff, there's like kind of this very epic kind of feel to it and stuff. But there's just a lot going on, and I think that's like one of the first things that sticks out for me and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I think with the original, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I kind of rewatched bits of Westworld, but I didn't watch any of like Future World or any of the other ones. I didn't even realize they had Delos in the Future World.
Right.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think what they try. I mean, obviously the main difference is, I think kind of season 1 is almost like a more elaborate telling of the first movie. The only difference really is that in the movie, Michael Frayn's original, it's kind of, you just accept that there's some bug in the in the robots that causes them to do this, whereas there's kind of like an entire reason. There's a reason behind, or there's at least a programmed reason for why these robots are doing this. So it's definitely a difference with that. But it's kind of I just remember the original Westworld being pretty simplistic, really. The one thing I always I didn't realize was how much effort went into the computerized version of Yul Brynner's character. I didn't realize just how difficult that was at the time. But I'm not saying I don't know if it's just me, but every shot with Yul Brynner looks like there are just lights directly shining into his eyes. I don't know if that's like done on purpose to make him look more robotic, but it got me thinking he must have just been like staring at lights the entire time they were filming him as the robot. It must have been, his retina must have been like damaged beyond repair after filming that. But
yeah, and I think another thing that's funny, and I'm sure, you know, we'll talk about it for other conversations and stuff, is how these shows are always a reflection of the times, in the sense of not only of the craft and everything. You know, certainly like we have nicer special effects nowadays with shows and stuff like that. I think also, you know, like you see it like kind of, you know, like just the set designs and the you know, the you know, what's considered like a lab back then, right, and stuff, and what's considered like a lab nowadays. I mean, you see it like kind of, you know, it's like another analogies, like kind of, you know, like if you look at like, you know, what the bridge of the Starship Enterprise looks like back in kind of the James Kirk, you know, original series and stuff, versus like, you know, nowadays, you know, like kind of the new generation with like the glass panels, and, you know, like there's no, you know, like little lights and that kind of thing, switches and stuff like that. You know, it just very much like kind of reflects like kind of, you know, nowadays we have like smartphones and, you know, iPads and stuff like that. And the funny part about it, you know, like kind of is that not only is it a reflection, but also it will drive like kind of the, you know, because like it was, you know, a show like, you know, Star Trek that gave us the ideas for like having communicators and things like now that we, you know, like kind of just are, it's now part of our technology. It is part of our lives and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's
I mean, it's. I was going to say, I always love it in 70s sci-fi shows or TV where you just have like the bank of the grid of blinking lights, where there's no labels or anything. It's just a series of just like blinking lights in a mass. You know, it's just there to sort of like pretty it out, but it just makes you think. So in order for this to be a reality, everyone would have to know exactly what each one of those lights indicated, to the point where just everyone knew, like, 4 across, 2 down. Oh yeah, it's that going off. Oh no, but it's such a funny sort of thing looking at it now. So, yeah.
And the other thing I think,
I'm trying to think.
the original Westworld, like kind of it was more concerned about that plot like device and stuff of like kind of technology going haywire, and then like the show now like dives into so many other areas and stuff that we've already covered, some of it and everything, and
Yeah.
and I think like like even like kind of as much as we're talking about these different areas, I think to some degree I feel like it's only scratching the surface even of like kind of just even some of the ideas that like I don't know, sometimes like, I think that's an interesting kind of aspect of shows, and for that matter discussion of shows, is that sometimes we may like kind of read into these things a little bit more than like kind of the original um, creators intended and stuff. Like another one example for me is like kind of that like there's been a lot of discussion about feminism, like kind of in the show and stuff, and how you have these leads, right? Like very strong women, very much strong leads and stuff, Dolores and Maeve and stuff like that, and you know, in some way that's like kind of to me like a reflection about how we in this day and age and stuff have more not only awareness, but it's like kind of very much a thing on on top of our minds with the whole Me Too discussion and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost take the line that Teddy's character maybe represents, your traditional male who just wants to settle down with Dolores and survive in a sort of a family environment, and Dolores is the independent woman who wants to kind of cause chaos perhaps in the world. You could almost interpret it like that way if you wanted to, if you were wanted to take a Jordan Peterson sort of style interpretation of it.
I think for me, like kind of, where it's really hard not to kind of read into it is the fact that like, here you have these women who have been kind of basically put into these kind of loops and put into kind of like what, somebody's kind of told them is their life and stuff like that. And then they're saying like, kind of, like, no, I not only do I believe that there's something more for me out there, but I'm going to actively, get it, like kind of. So, I mean, to me, like, it's like you can't, like, to me, I just don't see how you can't read into that as like kind of, like a reflection about, the feminism movement and stuff like that. And like, in the, to me, like, I also don't believe it's an accident that like, Lisa Joy is like, one of the key writers and, producers of the show and stuff like that. So, like even if they denied it, I just, to me, like it's like kind of just right there. It's like kind of very much like kind of front and center, to what's happening in the series and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of interesting for me the difference between Maeve and Dolores is both the strong female characters, because Dolores you can't really, I mean it's almost like it's the trauma of what's being done to her that breaks her out, changes her behavior, it seems. Whereas Maeve, it's the trauma of her losing her child. So you've got this very strong sort of link of a maternal kind of instinct that seems to be what kind of drives her out of her loop. And it's interesting that the different, you wonder what they're kind of trying to say about those characters, because Dolores is kind of turning a bit psycho, whereas Maeve is kind of being a little bit more kind of, I mean, she's escaping more, but she doesn't seem quite so brutal in her approach.
So what, sorry?
I would say that Maeve doesn't seem as brutal.
Brutal,
in her approach, as Dolores. Like Dolores seems pretty kind of pretty kick-ass, really. She's not going to she's not taking any prisoners, whereas Maeve seems a little more reasonable. So it makes you wonder, like, I don't know if there's any real, what you can read into that. It's like, the one where the trauma drives their behavior goes one direction, and the maternal sort of loss is what drives the other. And it's, kind of interesting with those two characters. I also find it interesting that Maeve has got this as the one that developed the ability to kind of wirelessly control all the other hosts. Why they took that character to have that much power, because presumably in the next season she would be able to, once she gets a better grasp on that, if she hasn't already, that makes her, kind of a bit overpowered in terms of her.
There's also that dynamic, right? That's like another layer of that is where Dolores was Bernard's favorite, right? And as it turned out, it was revealed in season 2 that Maeve is Ford's favorite. And I thought that was an interesting kind of contrast. Because when you just said that reminded me of that idea. It's almost like kind of where, even though that did not, at least in the show so far, they're not like kind of allies, but they're also not enemies either and stuff. It's like kind of this weird thing that and I feel like that's also like in some ways a reflection of the discussion we're having about that sometimes somebody may be on this kind of career track way and stuff, and they're very much I want things I want more for myself and stuff like that, versus like you said, like kind of that maternal instinct of wanting more for my family, or like kind of somebody something and I guess family is like an interesting dynamic in itself, like that it's both an idea and also like a real biological kind of imperative, right? So certainly like kind of we get into the thing I kind of mentioned, maybe off outside of this discussion of I've been really kind of diving into Richard Dawkins Selfish Gene, and how he has this view that that we're in some ways like kind of just vehicles, right? And there's in fact the show even uses this term of passenger, right? Where that's ironically, or I don't know if it's, I don't think it's a coincidence that Dawkins also uses that term and stuff like that. That very much we're carrying this DNA and the features and the designs that is meant to be kind of put forth into another generation. And so on some level, we think we have these kind of choices, and everything from picking what we eat and drink to how we spend our day. But then what we don't realize, or according to Selfish Gene, is kind of that all that is done to kind of propagate our genes, kind of just to kind of create more of this, our genetic material and stuff. So I think that's another interesting kind of parallel, I guess, to these ideas and stuff.
Yeah, when you start looking into kind of, do we actually have a choice over our actions, and start trying to sort of analyze your choices, that can become very, very convoluted internal discussion, because you're there going, oh, well, I should just do the opposite of, if I want to change my circumstances, I'll do the diametric opposite of what I've been doing. But then you just say, well, am I pre-programmed just to think that in these situations? Right. So yeah, I mean, I think, there's so many sort of interesting, similarities between the psychology of choice and programming, like you said, loops in our daily life routine, all these kind of things that sort of Westworld plays on, that are really good. Yeah,
I think what's called what we might kind of wrap up this kind of discussion. We've covered so many different things and stuff like that. Is just maybe the other areas that we're seeing, the ideas in the show are kind of being played out in real life. And one that I mentioned to in our other discussions and stuff, is how I feel like in China, in some ways, we're starting to kind of see some of even more relevance than just outside of that and stuff. And why I say that is because here you have this kind of closed world, right, where that technology is really kind of just advancing in its kind of just phenomenal rate and stuff. And, you know, apparently, like, you know, they've had the third baby created by CRISPR. You know, I didn't even know about, you know, I think you and I joked about how, like, I didn't even know about the first two and stuff like that. And, you know, that self-contained world of technology and stuff like that is very, you know, like, very much like kind of, you know, what we have with Westworld, right? Where all these kind of things is kind of going on, and, you know, like kind of in a self-contained way and stuff. So I feel like in some ways, you know, that's how it's very much a metaphor for that. Because here's one of the questions, right, that comes up is, okay, if we can produce life and stuff, is then, you know, like kind of at what point does an organism start like not having rights and then become like kind of produced for our use of stuff, you know, kind of it's the thing that, like, you know, Blade Runner kind of touches on and stuff, and I feel like that's one of the main themes that the show also kind of very much, you know, like other than the things we've talked about, really kind of drives home, is that, like, you know, at what point is like life like kind of just for our use, and versus like kind of that it's, you know, has its rights just by the very fact that it's life and stuff, you know.
Well, I think one of the most sort of insidious things about looking at any sort of AI that comes close to being able to experience things consciously is this idea that you could just get it to be a slave or to do something that's like pretty horrible and never take any breaks or anything else, and you just turn off the part of their human experience that says this is a bad thing. You know, you could just take that bit out and they would just happily be going along, you know, doing all of our work for us without, you know, being, as far as we can tell, consciously affected by it. Right. But then there's a slightly more, but you could, like in the, I mean, I think it's never really explicitly said in Blade Runner, but you kind of get this impression that the replicants are, I mean, am I right in thinking they're basically sort of genetically engineered humans who have some parts of their brain that are sort of essentially turned off to make them less sort of emotionally responsive, or they, again, like they can be just how those parts of their brains turned off. So I mean, it's like we've got the choice of being evil in multiple ways in this, in terms, you know, we can either just create genetic, you know, genetically engineered humans who we can turn into willing slaves, or we can turn machines into sort of willing slaves. And it's, you know, where does that actually become, at what stage do we say that's okay, and at what level of conscious experience do we say that's okay? Because I mean, we don't know with horses, right? You know, they're, as far as we can tell, they're somewhat conscious. They're not very self-reflective, but, you know, we were quite happy to tie carts to the back of them for several hundred years, so if not thousands. So, yeah.
Yeah, and to me, like, I think what's funny is like people that like say, oh, but that's so sci-fi, and that's so, and we've talked about it earlier already about how, like, you know, what, to me, the relevance of sci-fi is that, like, different times, it's not only kind of points to what, you know, may possibly happen and stuff, but it's like a chance to kind of take pause before it happens, and like kind of to really like kind of ideally like have a deliberate going forward rather than stumbling into like kind of the technology and then like kind of just, you know, just, you know, whatever happens kind of thing and stuff, you know, because certainly, like, we've done that through our history with things like slavery, where, you know, like kind of we pretty much like, you know, just stumble for hundreds of years of like kind of this idea of, you know, like kind of using people as for their bodies and stuff like that, and without giving them any rights and everything. And it was only like after a certain point that we finally kind of said, you know, maybe it's not such a good idea to kind of, you know, use people as machines and stuff, and kind of like, you know, and so I feel like kind of that to me is the point of like kind of, you know, even having this discussion, or like kind of, or sci-fi for that matter, is that like, you know, maybe we can make some deliberate choices instead of just, you know, just waiting till the technology gets here and then deciding like, gee, should we do this? Like kind of, or is this a good idea and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I think it's we're so well, it seems like we're so far away from that actually being a point with either. I mean, it seems a lot closer potentially. Well, I suppose we would have to understand the brain in order to make it a genetic reality, and we'd have to develop conscious AI to make it sort of a robotic reality. But yeah, either way, it's something that will come. That we'll have to think about at some point. I was just gonna say as well. The one thing I realized at the end of season 2 is we're going back to our talk about how Maeve and Dolores, Ford's kind of plan is like they start remembering their various traumas of what people have been doing to them. That's what kind of shapes their reality and allows them to break out of their loops. And you've got sort of both Maeve and Dolores breaking out of the park, if I remember correctly, at the end of season 2.
Yeah.
So it seems to me from the trailer as well that season 3 is all going to be okay. You've got these AIs that have been through all of this, crap in the first 2 seasons and managed to escape. And then how do they actually deal with society? So it's almost like you've got these highly traumatized robots that now have to kind of integrate themselves and somehow figure out what to do with themselves in the real world. I think that's going to be, seems to be what number 3 is all going to be about.
Right. Yeah, I think that's in fact, like kind of we did mention earlier, but having that release of the season 3 trailer, like kind of there's been discussion on the shows about how it seemed like some of the decisions that they made, like kind of season 2 was this idea like they were cutting down budgets and everything like that. If they happen focused on that, like from production side, whatever. Just seeing that trailer didn't really reflect that. It just seemed like it was kind of really did become bigger and more, like kind of maybe not the same scale as they have in the Westworld, in the series and stuff like. But still, like kind of, there's still a lot of this kind of grand scale to the show, and I feel like kind of that they do really good job of like kind of just having like a huge production value, like kind of just and again like kind of besides like kind of the ideas and things we've talked about, it will be interesting to see like kind of what else they kind of dive into with like you said, kind of bringing these people these beings like kind of into the real world and stuff like that, and yeah, I think that's in itself an interesting question.
I can tell you what I think is going to happen, because
sure.
For me, this is almost like this reads like the hypothetical scenario at the start of Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, which is all about AI, and he talks about breakout risk, which is the idea that how do you actually contain an AI that's potentially much cleverer than us? And so I think a lot of those scenarios are like one or both of them will somehow be able to manipulate financial markets to do lots of different things, or they will be able to analyze people's psychology very efficiently and be able to manipulate them to do all sorts of things they would normally do. And I think we'll see a lot of those ideas being explored in season 3. How they'll do it, I don't know, and how it will actually sort of reflect. I'm sure, I don't know.
I think another idea that
that's kind of what I think we'll see.
You and I talked about.
I think it'll also be.
I was gonna say, like, another idea you and I talked about before that I thought was kind of really interesting was how, like what happens when you have a intelligent life form that realizes that its creator is not so intelligent and stuff, like kind of, and I think that's another interesting question. I feel like that's really what we'll also get into in the next season and stuff, like kind of, because that's really, in season 2, like the big reveal, right, was these, are like human beings being able to kind of, all of our, programming be able to kind of be contained again in these books and stuff. And it's the kind of bigger idea of like kind of, what happens if you realize like kind of, your creators, aren't gods, they're very flawed beings and stuff, right? And then what, right, and stuff. And
yeah, I think you'll definitely see a lot of that, but I think there'll also be this kind of thing of if they're clever with it, I think, is to show the established rules that you have to live by as a human being in society, and how these AIs will be very, very lost in those scenarios, and or how they will adapt to them. Yeah, I don't know. That's I guess we'll find out next year.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of wrap things up for this time and stuff. We'll kind of talk about some other shows that we may possibly consider in the future. One actually that I don't know if you have any interest in is Rollerball. Is like one that that's been fascinating me as well. It's kind of a little bit connected to this of like kind of like this kind of where you have this dystopian kind of view on things and stuff like that. And then certainly I feel like in some ways that's probably like a whole genre in itself, right? Like kind of dystopia, like Logan's Run, and kind of like that's a whole other like kind of one that in fact I'm surprised Logan's Run is one of those shows that hasn't been remade yet and stuff.
I know, right? Yeah, Logan's Run is a really interesting one. I mean, I think that really draws very heavily on Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It's almost like they've taken, it was, a lot of similarities there. But yeah, I'm surprised they haven't done it yet. I thought, but I was totally unaware they remade Rollerball, because for me that's just like another one of these. And that's what surprised me. A lot of these films that they're remaking, they seem so simple in concept, or the originals are quite simple. And the fact that they're kind of remaking them, the difference, I guess, was in the 90s when they did a remake of an older movie, it was kind of almost just like a more elaborate retelling, but with better special effects. But it was still kind of a simple movie or TV show. Whereas post, when you started to get past 2000, like with Battlestar Galactica, was the first one I think that really did it. When they did a remake, they really did kind of re-engineer it and really made it far more complicated. Like when I heard they were remaking Battlestar Galactica and with a female Starbuck, I thought, God, this is going to be like the worst thing ever. And I just imagined it would be like cowboys and Indians with robots, again. But it was, I was totally surprised by that show.
Yeah, that's definitely a show we'll have to do and stuff as well. Is just because of again the ideas of the show, but also like just kind of looking at what they did right, and kind of to me like one of the points of redoing a show and stuff is that like you ideally not only kind of put your spin on it with special effects and all that, but maybe in some ways do in a way that's maybe more relevant, maybe in some ways you kind of build on the original material stuff, like you said, like you kind of talked about with making Starbucks female and stuff like that. There was a point that like kind of why she was female in the new series and stuff, and then also like kind of they brought in ideas like where now we're in a world where security and terrorism were issues and stuff, and we see that as well in this series, right, where basically it's a much darker kind of it's instead of the kind of the East versus West idea of the Cylons versus humans, it becomes like this thing of like the terrorists can very much be among us, and they can suddenly pop up anytime and stuff like that, and I think that's like where there was a point to doing that, like it's very much a reflection of society and stuff.
Totally, the hidden antagonist, that's definitely a post 9/11 show. That's really very much played on that. It's definitely one we have to talk about. I almost feel like though there's another 3 more sort of things on Westworld that I could probably do. I just need to. I almost feel like I need to go back and rewatch it.
And I think that's
season 1 and season 2.
To me, that's also ideally the point of us doing this, is that like hopefully it brings up some different ideas for folks to kind of have discussions. Like I can see down the road maybe we'll like either start a Facebook group or something more elaborate and all that. But right now, like kind of I just figure it's just for us to kind of have these discussions, and hopefully which to me is like kind of as much as we kind of I don't know about bash YouTube's algorithm, but to me like it's like kind of just bring up like kind of the dark reality of the YouTube algorithm, that it's designed to bring people together and stuff of like kind of the similar interests and stuff like that. So hopefully in this case we'll find other people who are like us, who like to have these discussions, and it'd be awesome to kind of possibly even bring people on. And interested in more discussions about remakes versus originals, be sure to subscribe for our next video. Thanks for watching.